Okay. Um, Halito, and welcome back, everyone, to the Chata Tishole Virtual Speaker Series. Saho Chifawet Megan Baker, and I'll be your host today. If today is your first or maybe your 13th time attending one of our Chata Tishole events, we're really glad that you're joining us here today. Since today's speaker sparked a lot of interest from our community members, I kind of wanted to share a little bit about the background of our speaker series before we started. So Choctaw Nation Historic Preservation started this series in May 2020 to share Choctaw history and knowledge with our community members at a time when many of us were at home helping to keep each other safe during the pandemic. Chata Tisholi, which we translate to be interpreter of Choctaw knowledge, shares the work of Choctaw elders, community members, and scholars. It's an opportunity to engage with each other as we collectively learn about our history as a nation. So today, I'm so excited to have Dr. Daniel Littlefield as our Chata Tisholi, who is one of our most requested speakers from the community members. Dr. Littlefield is the director of the Sequoia National Research Center and author and editor of numerous books on the 5 tribes, including Seminole Burning, Chickasaw Removal, Cherokee Freedmen, and Native American writing in the Southeast, among many others. And while he hasn't written a book about Choctaw solely, he still knows a lot about it. Since Choctaw obviously share a similar history with the other 5 tribes. Like the notable Oklahoma historian and author of The Rise and Fall of the Choctaw Republic, Angie DeBow, who was also one of his mentors in graduate school, Dr. Littlefield has researched and the history of the 5 tribes since their forced relocation to Indian Territory. I can't think of anyone else who is more suited to be our Chata Tisholi today on this topic. And if you've ever gone through the documents on removal yourself, you know it's an insane amount of records that you have to kind of go through and know. And he's gone through so many of them. So that's what he's going to kind of talk about with us today. He's also helped our Choctaw Nation Historic Preservation Research Team. They've gone to his archive over there at the Sequoia National Research Center, and he's helped us out on various projects that we've had. So it's also great to kind of touch on that. So you're watching us from WebEx, and if you have any questions for Dr. Littlefield, as they come up, you can put them in the Q&A function or the chat as well. You can submit them at any time while we're talking, and then we'll try and go through all of the questions during the last half hour that we have allocated for today. So we might as well just get started. Hi, Dr. Littlefield. How are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Good. So my first question is, I actually met you in 2019 during the Chickasaw annual festival, and you were promoting your book, Chickasaw Freedmen, and that was kind of the first time that I got to meet you in person, which was pretty cool. And then I later watched an interview that you did on your Chickasaw Removal book, and you mentioned that you've done research on all of the 5 tribes. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the specific history of Choctaw removal and how it might have been different from the other 5 tribes.
Okay. We began our research here at the Sequoia National Research Center on Indian removal in general in the year 2000. And what really caused us to get into that was the fact that the National Historic Trail of Tears National Historic Trail comes through Arkansas, and the Trail of Tears Association was really beginning to crank up at that time. And we had some problems with the way that legislation was written, just for the Cherokee Nation. And we knew, of course, that the other tribes had come through, and all had come through first. And so once we decided we would work on the Cherokees with the National Park Service, we did research on all of the tribes. because there was the context there that Cherokee removal fit into. Well, we found out that the mayor of North Little Rock was planning to build condominiums on property that had been the place where the tribes crossed the river, the Choctaws and Chickasaws crossed, where the other tribes came to Little Rock and then went the military road. And so uh, we wrote we told him, would you please hold off until we can do a site report on North Little Rock? So what we did in that site report, which we finished first draft in 2002, we did all of the tribes that came through the North Little Rock site. Now that material is still available on the National Park Service website. And so we had problems with getting the National Park Service to, in its signage on the trail, to include the other tribes in that. And over the years, we were able to get more and more of that information in, but we never stopped our research on all of the other tribes. And the latest project we did was to develop a website devoted to Indian removal through Arkansas. And that just went live in October. And then we have a touchscreen table here in the center, which we designed at the same time, so that when we get back to the public admission to the center, they will be able to, use a touchscreen device rather than click on things, and develop itineraries, because we've got a lot of people from out of state who are driving areas along the trail and they want to know, well, where do we go from here, or where would you suggest we go? And this way they can search by tribe, or they can search by route, they can search by just about any way they want to figure out, what they want to do. So in the process of looking at all the tribes, including the Choctaws, of course, all of them were different from the others. None of them, because of tribal history, they were different. But the Choctaws had a different experience to start with, because they were the first under the trail of the Indian Removal Act to be removed. And there had been some smaller groups from the New York area and Great Lakes moving to the west earlier than that, but there had never been an attempt to move large numbers of people wholesale like this was. And so it was a different experience, and the original plan was to have the Commissary General of Subsistence oversee that removal, and they would ship the Choctaws by boat down to the mouth of the Red River and up the Ouachita to Courfeybury, which is now Camden, Arkansas. And there they would go overland to Washington, and then on into Fort Towson area was the end point. And of course, they ran into all kinds of problems. Most of those had to do with mismanagement. There was a lack of adequate supplies, foodstuffs, that kind of thing. And then the weather worked against this, or the early removals of the Choctaws. We had the coldest weather that had been known in this part of the country in the winter of 1830, 31, 32, those winters. And there were, in 31, there were ice flows in the Mississippi River as far south as Vicksburg. And that's how intense the weather was. So the federal government then fairly quickly shifted its plans and turned that over to the War Department. And the War Department, of course, was much better at logistics than the Commissary of General of Subsistence had been. And so they had various routes that they wanted to go from overland to Memphis, from Memphis down to the Arkansas, Memphis overland, Vicksburg up to the Arkansas and so on. Um, and then the overland groups would come to Little Rock and then go, most of them to the southwest on the old Southwest Trail. Um, and for the most part, that worked because the government set up ration stations about every 10 to 12 miles. And sometimes when the Choctaws decided they didn't want to go exactly the way the government wanted them to, then they would have to hustle and find supplies. But the difference in this method and what had been happened across the southern part of the state was that the military officers who had oversight of the removal parties had disbursing authority. This meant that they could negotiate with farmers, they could negotiate with merchants, they could negotiate with pharmacies, and whatever they needed, that they had the authority to buy, and they gave receipts, and then the person had to collect the money later. So they were better supplied, but they still had the cold weather to contend with. Um, and but the upshot of all of that, and this was a learning game for the federal government, and that was how Choctaw removal differed. The time they were on the road, I mean, they suffered the same way anybody would have at that time, traveling as they had to. But as a result of that, the Choctaws have more miles of road, overland routes, and water routes in the state of Arkansas than any of the other tribes. And if you look at the map of Choctaw removal routes, it's obvious when you shift from that, say, to Seminoles that had the fewest miles in the state, because most of them went up the rivers. So um, is that me popping, or can you hear a popping sound?
I do.
It must be in my system when I move or something. I'm sorry, I have to use headphones. This is minimum budget.
No worries at all.
but but if I were uh, to say how I was different, I would just say the amount of time it took, the experimentation. For instance, the government hadn't counted on Choctaws wanting to bring livestock with them. And with tribal people, livestock was wealth, and they it was movable, and they could bring it with them. And so then the groups that came to Memphis in 1832 were supposed to take the steamboats to Fort Gibson. And even though the water was navigable at that time, that was the period when the uh, cholera epidemic hit the South. And the Choctaws, primarily the women, refused to get on the boats, and because they didn't want their children, to get sick, they associated that with the boats. And they were right about that. So they would rather fight the swamps overland in eastern Arkansas than to take those boats. Now, the sad thing was that some of them took the boats from Memphis to Rock Row, Arkansas, and they brought the cholera with them on the boats. And the that was Rock Row was the place where 19, we know, Choctaws died there of the cholera. And then about that many more were lost in those groups between there and Little Rock. And if, one of the sad side effects of that was that when the first group of Choctaws came to Little Rock and crossed the river to go southwest, they came right through the city, or city town of Little Rock at the time. But then when the second group came, they heard that they had cholera, so they rerouted them around Little Rock. They moved them through what they call the Lower Ferry at that time, and made a road around the town of Little Rock. And the Choctaws were responsible for the first hospital being built in Arkansas because the city bought a house and here in Little Rock and made that a hospital. And expecting the cholera to be bad. So, um, I anything else on?
Yeah, so that seems to be like kind of the first wave of removals that you're describing. But someone asked, did they not also take other kind of routes? Did some go through Fort Smith, or could you say a little bit more about the different kind of waves of removal?
Yes, the steamboat traffic. Some went by steamboats. Steamboat traffic was dependent on the level of water between Little Rock and primarily Dardanelle. If they could get that far, generally they could go on up the river. But groups that were stranded, then the conductors would have to hustle and get supplies and hire wagons and teams and so on. So yes, some of them did. And then many of them crossed the river at Dardanelle and went west from Dardanelle. Now, those that went to the Choctaw Agency at Scullyville didn't, and that was where they were headed, did not go through Fort Smith. That road went south of Fort Smith. It's in the city limits now, but at the time they skirted around Fort Smith, and by the time that second wave of we call them the removal seasons, and that had to do with the fact that the tribes moved in the fall and winter months because they were agricultural and they had to get where they were going in time to put in a crop. Uh, uh, they tended early on, the conductors, to skirt around towns if they could because the whiskey peddlers made it a habit of preying on the tribes when they came through. And so part of that was an attempt to keep the whiskey peddlers out of the camps at night. So yes, there were some who went through Fort Smith by boat, and some who went overland near Fort Smith to the Choctaw Agency. Yeah. Yep.
Thanks for that. And could you maybe also describe a little bit about the areas that Choctaws were coming from? Like what parts of Mississippi are some of these removal parties coming from?
Well, they were coming from everywhere, and that's, in the Choctaw Nation. Now, the Choctaw Nation was divided into 3 districts, and with each had a district chief. And the 3 district chiefs who were sitting when the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek was signed were deposed afterwards because the people didn't like the treaty, but the government failed to recognize the duly elected district chiefs. So that left Mashulatubbee, Nettipeche, and Greenwood LaFleur and often, and that's how they identified the districts. They identified them by the chiefs, and so a group might be made up of people from more than one district. And the ones who were over in Alabama and the eastern part of the Choctaw Nation, their tendency was to go to Memphis, overland on what was called the Cotton Gin Port Memphis Road, and then into Arkansas. Ones from the southern districts tended to go to Vicksburg and up. And so, and it's really, it's going to take somebody who really knows Choctaw political history to identify all of those. But here's one of the tendencies that happened, though. We know that Mashulatubbee followers and a lot of people from his district went up on the Arkansas watershed And then the ones who had been following the deposed, the newly elected chiefs who would never recognized by the federal government, most of those went to the Red River watershed. And that was one way that the Choctaws avoided that kind of warfare that the Cherokees witnessed. And the Creeks had that potential too, but they worked that out in Arkansas before they got to the Indian Territory. And so they avoided that kind of conflict, social conflict after removal. But the difficulty with all of that and determining who belonged to which district where is that you might have a group that was made up of people from different districts, and that had to do with who was leading the group, how ready they were to go at the time, and a number of factors determine when they actually made that trek to the river and then on west.
Yeah, and so we also have, I know there's like a northern kind of part and the southern. And so someone was asking, where in the northern part of Choctaw Nation was the Choctaw Agency closest to Fort Smith? Is that at Scullyville or?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, it was. The Choctaw Agency in the west was at Scullyville. Yeah. Okay. I don't know if it was called that at the time, but that's where it was. It was just north of Fort Coffee, which was right on the river. And there's still a little community called Fort Coffee now, just as there is with Scullyville. So.
Yeah, and could you say maybe a little bit about the history of the agency and what was its kind of purpose? Yeah.
Well, the Choctaw land in Arkansas was set up under the Treaty of Doak's Stand in 1820. And so there was already this land west of Arkansas that had been assigned to the Choctaws. And that agency up there was not set up originally for, taking care of Choctaw affairs, but it was primarily to receive the Choctaws who came to the west. And then it ultimately became not just an agency for the Choctaws to oversee Choctaw affairs and then the rations that were guaranteed to the individuals for so many months after they got to the West. But it also became the office for the Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Southwestern District. And it remained that, for many, many years after removal. I don't know exactly the dates, but I know it was still there in the late 1840s and into the 50s. So, yeah.
Great. So we still have a couple of questions like this, but I kind of want to move on until some of the other prepared questions. So in your book, Seminole Burning, you mentioned that you took a class with the Five Tribes historian, Angie DeBow. Could you say maybe a little bit about her for our viewers who might not be acquainted with her work, and kind of what was it like to work with her, and about and how she influenced how you studied Indian removal and Oklahoma history?
Well, Angie DeBow was blacklisted in Oklahoma higher education because of her book "And Still the Waters Run." In fact, it was just a manuscript when they blacklisted her, because she named some names in there of people who were involved in acquiring Indian resources sort of under shady circumstances, and they were pretty politically influential. But she was curator of maps at Oklahoma State University, and I was an undergraduate student there. And she was able to fill in one summer for B.B. Chapman to teach Oklahoma history. Well, I think I was 19 years old at the time, and I took Oklahoma history from her. It was the only class that I took that I remember every student being there every day, sitting on the edge of their seat, waiting for that woman to walk through the door. It was like listening to somebody tell fairy tales to a bunch of kids, and she had a way of teaching that taught us how to read resources and evaluate those. We had that old Wardell and Dale Oklahoma history text, and then she would put materials on reserve in the library, and then we had to look up material of our own in the library. And so every Friday she would make us write an essay, and we had to use all three of those resources to make this essay on a particular topic that she had assigned, and we had to do informal kind of citations. John Smith says, Joe Henry believes, so on, and then write a cogent essay. Well, she called me up after class one day, and she said, Mr. Littlefield, she had this little cracked voice. She said, have you ever thought about writing history? And what does a 19-year-old know? I mean, I said, no, Dr. DeBow, I haven't. She said, well, you have a knack for it. That's what she called it. And so I finished the course with her, and she lived out at Marshall, Oklahoma, west of Stillwater there. And the drugstore where I played pinball machine was a place where she got her medication, picked up her medications. And so I'd be playing pinball machine, and inevitably I was just about to win, and somebody would punch me in the ribs, and I'd look down, and it was Dr. Debo. He said, what are you writing, Mr. Littlefield? I said, I'm not writing anything, Dr. Debo. And she said, well, I've been reading a history of, I don't know, she'd name somebody. She said, and I don't like that biography. She says, you got to write about it. And of course, here I am, I had no idea. And besides that, my degree was in literature. I had a double major in literature and political science. And so anyway, it took me a number of years to really have it soak in, what she had been telling me. And she said to me, tell a good story and everything else will fall in place. That was one of her favorite sayings. And I really took that to heart. And as a teacher of writing, I decided that I was not going to be like a lot of teachers of writing who didn't write. And so I decided that I would write following my own teaching, how to organize nonfiction. And that's what got me into it. And I would run topics by her, and she would talk to me about them, and she and I stayed in touch. I think the last real advice she gave me was like 1972, when I wanted to get an NEH fellowship to go to Washington, D.C. and work in the National Archives, and I sent my proposal to her. And she looked at it and she said, this is good. She said, go ahead and file it. And so I did. And I really owe her a great deal because she really made me turn in another direction. Now, I taught literature. I have a degree in modern poetry, and I taught literature for 45 years at the university level. And then in 2005, I was put into this position. But my writing, and I did some literary criticism. I could do it again today, but I wouldn't waste my time. And by then I had written, quite a bit. And so and that was where my heart really was in the writing and research. So, but she really instilled that in me. So
That's great. So interesting to hear because it's. I did notice that you were a kind of literary scholar, but then you did so much kind of historical work, and I was also a little curious about how you kind of made that pivot.
mm-hmm. Well, it wasn't easy. I got criticism from my colleagues in English departments because, and I'm still tenured in the English department here, uh, because I wasn't writing in the field. And then what happened was that I decided, okay, I'll satisfy them. I'll write about native literature. And so that was one of the ways I made a transition that made me acceptable in the eyes of the literary folks. So,
Yeah, that's kind of what I see a lot of the research, like especially Oklahoma and about Oklahoma, is that it's about literature and not necessarily about like history and politics. Um,
mm,
Someone asked, do you consider your work on the Choctaws and the Five Tribes political writing?
no, I don't consider it political. Um, I I try to write a good story, like Angie told me to, and um, and my purpose in writing is to get information out to people. And I know that, and I know from experience of writing, and that's what I used to tell my students. If a human being writes it, there's something wrong with it. It's just the way we are. But we can't wait till we find every piece of evidence about every topic to publish it, or we'd never publish anything because you'd have to know everything that existed about that topic. And so the question is, at what point do I think I've got this topic well enough treated that it will say something meaningful to people, and so on. And I've yet to publish a book that the minute it came off the press, I didn't wish I had it back, and because I had something to add to it. It's just, I think it's just the nature of writing. So,
Cool. And so Angela asked, what's the inspiration for you to study the history of freedmen in particular? Because you're really well known for your work in this, and it's, everyone turns to you when they want to know that history.
well, Angie always said she had blind spots.
Mm-hmm.
And she wanted me to try to fill some of those blind spots. And one of her blind spots was the freedmen of five tribes. And so I said, okay, I'll take up that topic. And that was the topic I submitted to the National Endowment for the Humanities in 1972 to go to the National Archives. I was a fellow in residence at Johns Hopkins University in the old Institute of Southern and Negro History. And I was there for a year doing nothing but research. So, and that was what got me started. Now, I did a book on the African descended people among four of the tribes. I never did do the Choctaw. I copied enough resources in Washington to do it, but I thought, oh, some younger scholar can do this. And there was a woman, and whose name now escapes me, that I sent all my notes to once to let her copy, and she was a PhD candidate at University of Kansas at the time, I think, and so she copied them and sent them back to me. But that book, I don't think, has ever been written. So,
Yeah, there's always just so much scholarship that like I see it kind of because I work in archives as well. There's so much that people haven't kind of studied or written about. And so I've also was like, I wish there was more people working on Oklahoma and the five
Yeah.
tribes to work on this.
Yeah.
Angela also says, send your notes her way. She says that they use your book in her genealogy of freedmen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Another person asked, so what inspired you to work on the Encyclopedia of American Indian Removal, and how do you see it best used?
Um, that was part of our dissatisfaction with what the National Historic Trail of Tears had project had done. Uh, we thought, okay, there are other tribes that were removed in the five tribes. There are some things in the five tribal removals that have been stylized for so long that we don't, and so we thought that it was time to ask the scholars who had worked in those fields to contribute to something that people could put in public libraries and university libraries, and it would be a handy reference to removal, which did not exist at the time we did that, and nothing up to date. And you have to remember too that since 2000, there has been a phenomenal amount of research done on Indian removal, and that hadn't been accounted for in any of the scholarship. Now, the book we did on Chickasaw removal and the book that Havman did on creek removal, Muskogee Creek removal, those are the only two books that I'm aware of that has come out of the new research that's been done in the last 20 years. And those other books need to be done, because now we know, for instance, until about 2006, researchers didn't know about the Treasury Department records. And Jerry, what was his last name? Anyway, Cherokee guy who was an archivist at the National Archives. I had dealt with him for a number of years on research projects I did up there, and he said, well, you need to look at, if you're looking at removal, you need to look at the Treasury Department records. And we were the first to go out there in Maryland and look at those records. And when I say we, I'm talking about my graduate assistants and my interns. I've tried to teach these people, about research all through this 20 years. So, but um, um,
Yeah, I know. It's so kind of crazy. That no one has really looked at treasury records. I remember you telling about your Chickasaw removal book, saying like that was your kind of main source that you kind of draw the entire book around. Could you explain a little bit more of why the treasury records are particularly good ones for understanding the history of removal?
okay. Um, the officers that went with the tribal groups to the west had disbursing authority. This meant that they had to account for every dime they spent. And so when they would go buy 10 bushels of corn from a farmer, they would give the farmer a receipt. And if when he turned that in to an office to get his money, he was there was another receipt written. So in most transactions, there are two receipts. Now, these are very specific as to people, places where they're written, and the dates, and so on. And, and what we knew about Indian removal was pretty stylized, like what you see in Grant Foreman's book, for instance, Indian removal. And the real nuts and bolts of removal we didn't have information about. And Angie DeBow was guilty of that in um, uh, uh, her book on creek removal. She'll get them to the Mississippi River and then shoot them out the other side of Arkansas. And most of them did that. And Arkansas was, of course, we were looking for Arkansas, because we knew all the tribes came through here, and so that gave us specifics about removal. So we can tell you right now by looking at our records where every group was in this state every day they were in the state, and we can tell you what their health condition was for the most part. We can tell you, what the weather was like. We can tell you, and all of that has to do with the fact that these officers had to balance their accounts. And if they were a dime off, they had to go to Washington and settle their accounts in person. Now, some of them kept diaries called journals of occurrence. That was a requirement by most of the time. But some of them, when they would go to Washington to settle their accounts, they would give another day-by-day account of what happened and why they spent this money. And so we have, sometimes more than one document that will tell us the same story. And so we have a kind of verification there that we just didn't have in these older histories. And of course, I understand why Foreman and the older historians, they were having to dig through boxes of records in the old post office building. And, that was before the National Archives was organized in 1934. And so, it's a history that I think has languished because it was not treated, and one thing that wasn't treated was the tribal participation in this. I mean, I told a group of Cherokees one time, I was talking to them, I said, if you believe that story, that the Cherokees just, were pushed west at the point of a bayonet and just blindly went to the west and didn't protest. I said, that must have been the dumbest bunch of Indians that ever lived. And the Cherokees, of course, says, no, but, of course I mean, that was the way they survived. They had to take care of daily routines and things, and for instance, we didn't know, how did they cook on these steamboats? Do you know that? You know how they cooked on steamboats?
I don't know.
Yeah, well, most people didn't. And I remember reading Huckleberry Finn. Have you ever read that book? The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain? Huck and Jim are floating down the river on a raft, and they build a fire in the middle of the raft. They build an oven or a hearth in the middle of the raft, and they cook on that. That's what they did on these steamboats. They built these hearths on the upper deck, and people could cook.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, it's just we learned all kinds of things in this process that, and we knew they had to get by somehow. They had to survive somehow. And so, and that was one of the ways. I mean,
yeah, I think it's really, I'm glad you could share this with everyone, because you assume that financial records would only money and that kind of stuff, but instead it's a far more richer kind of resource to learn about this history. And so you just take a document and for face value, but you have to kind of think about all the different creative ways you can interpret it and understand it and situate it in history.
Yep.
Great. Yep. And so since you've done all this kind of work in the National Archives, I was wondering, could you tell some of our community members who might have never been there but want to do research there what it's kind of like? Like, how would you kind of approach doing research on at the National Archives whenever we can go back? How they might kind of do that?
Okay. The records that most people in looking at removal, and of course Indian policy, any of the Indian affairs topics. Um, they will be looking at records of the Office of Indian Affairs for the Dawes post Civil War period, Dawes Act period. They'll be looking at Department of Interior records, and they'll look at the Treasury records. Make sure I don't. Commissary General of Subsistence. Now, the early Choctaw removal records are all in the Commissary General of Subsistence, or most of them are. Okay. So, if you're going to the National Archives, you need to be prepared when you go. The first thing you'll have to do is go to the main office where they give you research assistance and get a card. And that card is good for a year. And if I don't go for a year between visits, then I have to get a new card each time. And I don't know how many of those I have, but but anyway, then you need to talk to the reference librarians there, archivists, and have some idea of what you're looking for when you go, what group of records you want to look at. And you can find inventories of most of these online in the National Archives site. So browse those, get an idea of what you're looking at, what you want to look at, what period, what your topic is, and all that. And then you'll find that there's a routine. They pull records. You put in these call slips for the records. Okay. They pull records only at certain times during the day. And so you have to make sure that you get your call slips in ahead of a particular call, whether you're going to do it in the morning or afternoon or what. And then when they get those records pulled, they send those to the main reading room, and that's where you go through the records. Now, in the main reading room, they will have photocopy machines. Now, in the digital age, they have camera stands, and people were already beginning to use those a lot the last time I was there. But camera stands, they will let you have your own scanners. If it's one that you put it on a plate, they don't want you to run a document through a scanner. And the wand scanners, they'll let you use those if you don't run it over the physical paper. You have to hold it up. And of course, I don't find that very effective, but at least if you're good and have a hand that's not as shaky as mine, it might work. But in other words, it takes a while to figure out their system. And so you can't go up there and do research in a day. So plan on staying several days.
Yeah, I've been there a couple of times, and it is overwhelming.
Yeah.
You get there trying to figure out, because you don't realize how much of the records that they actually have and how everything is in so many different kinds of places.
Yeah.
And it takes, so long to figure out even record group 75, which is where most of the tribal documents.
Correspondence, yeah. Mm. Yeah. Well, and two, you have to have a sense of how the bureaucracy in that period defined the categories of documents. And in those in Record Group 75, in the letters received by the Office of Indian Affairs, they had categories like education, resources, and culture, and I can't remember what all the categories were, but land was one. But sometimes those lines aren't that clear, and so you might be looking in this file when all the time it was in this file. next to it, and so it's a lot of it's hit and miss and trial and error. So
Yeah. So Angela asked in particular, she found some records of the Choctaw Chickasaw Freedmen Conference at the National Archives at Archives 2. Are there any other resources for 19th century freedmen organizations that you might know of at National Archives?
No, and I would not venture into that because a lot of that has been reorganized since I was there and working on that topic. That was in 1970s, when 73 when I was there, working on that topic, and I know that they've moved some of that stuff around. So I really, there was a file in Record Group 75 that was related to Friedman at the time. I did my work up there, and I right now I can't recall what it was called, but it should be in the notes of that. I think probably in the Chickasaw Friedman book. So you might check that and see. But other than that, I don't know of any collection that relates to that subject. And that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because it's just that I don't know it. So
and someone else has also read that in the congressional record, there are photographs taken of freedmen who were enrolled by the Dawes Commission, and if he wants to know if you've ever come across any images of them in your research.
There are images in the serial set, U.S. serial set. Now, the problem with many U.S. serial sets, the hard copy, is that people have filched the photographs. So, but if you can find a set that's pretty well intact, there were a number of photographs taken of freedmen enrolling, and I've seen those. I don't have copies, but I've just seen them in the research that I've done. So I do know that there are in that period. Yeah.
Yeah. So Angela says those are the Exhibit G, part of Senate document 5013, if anyone there is interested. She said she had an archivist look in the stacks for her, but they couldn't find the file. Oh no, that's so terrible, stealing from the archives.
I know. Well, and the other, I'll give you an example of what happens. When I looked at the Treasury Department records last, they were out in Maryland. They have since been moved to the downtown archives, and the old box numbers have been changed. So that means that the inventory I took when I was doing my research is no longer valid. So, I don't know, that would mean a whole new learning experience again. So, yeah. So that may have happened with that file too. Maybe in a special case, they have files of special cases in the Interior Department, and I have a feeling that may be, where some of it might be now, because they've been reorganizing that stuff.
Also, just wanted to throw in some of the Bureau of Indian Affairs M234 are available on Family Search for free, and that's been helpful for her as a researcher. Okay. So if anyone's interested, you could look there.
Yeah. Well, I still crank that on microfilm.
Microfilm.
Yeah, we have all that in microfilm here for the 5 tribes. Yeah. So.
Also related to microfilm is our next question is the newspapers, because you use a lot of newspapers, especially at the Sequoia National Research Center. I know you guys have an amazing kind of collection of Native American newspapers. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and what you've learned from newspapers in specifically as a kind of resource about the past that you might not expect.
Okay, it's a question that historians have asked for a long time about the value of news reports. Well, we know how accurate or inaccurate news reporting can be, and it depends on who's the writer. Uh, and so um, I always look at newspaper resources as kind of a last resort. Um, there are things that they can tell you outside the documentary history. For instance, we're lucky here in Arkansas because we have a newspaper that's been published steadily from 1819 to the present. Arkansas Gazette, the first newspaper established west of the Mississippi River. This means that that paper was publishing all during removal. The Indian Advocate was published here during removal. And so we have two newspapers that were going contemporaneously with this event. That gives us a little balance if we're looking at the same issue or the same event or whatever. But uh, you also have to take into account that the political bias of people at the time, the racial bias of people at the time, and so you'll read these reports about a group of 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 tribal people who just have gone through the central Arkansas, and they seem happy and satisfied. And now, come on here, how could you come overland, from Mississippi to Little Rock, Arkansas, and feel happy and satisfied? I mean, and you've given up everything you knew before you left, everything you owned. I mean, how could you be happy? And so that tells us a good deal about non-Indian society in Arkansas at the time. What was their thinking about Indians? And so you can use that for information about social attitudes and that kind of thing. Then uh, that's how we know so much about the weather.
Yeah.
Yeah, in Arkansas, because we had newspapers that were reporting even temperatures. We can tell you what the temperature was on some of those days, and people, how well dressed were these folks coming through in 10-degree temperature? I mean, come on here. It tells us something that we can't get out of the documents, and so you have to balance that, and it's sometimes just a call. You have to, your best bet. And if it's about some part of it that you don't know anything about, that's the only words you've got about it, then always qualify to say the newspaper says this, and I'll give you an example of that. Some of the groups going up the road to Fort Gibson from Little Rock made good time until they hit the hurricane. And it always had the in front of it, the hurricane. Well, what was the hurricane? So we started looking up hurricane season of 1835 or whatever year it was. And it was there were a large number of hurricanes that came into the Gulf of Mexico that year, and all these spin-offs of tornadoes brought timber down across the roads, the military road, and so they had to work their way through this jungle of down timber, and that was called the hurricane. And then there was later on, it was when it was cleared up, there was a little place there called Hurricane, Arkansas. Um, so, and if we hadn't had a newspaper, reports of hurricanes at that time, we wouldn't have known why they were calling that, and why it was such an obstacle to people going along a road. So it wasn't a storm. We knew that because it was the hurricane, and it lasted for years.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so what about also, because I know you guys collect American newspapers themselves, right? Like published and produced, kind of all of that. And could you say maybe a little bit about those? And
We have about 28 to 3,000 final titles in our collection. And what got us started with this and what caused us to, Jim Perrins and me, to uh, establish the center was that we were both teaching literature, teaching native literature, and we were having trouble finding some resources. And so we decided to do a bibliography of native writers and we did. We published a volume that covered the period from 1772 to 1924, citizenship year. And what we realized in that was that they were publishing in certain kinds of publications. A lot of those came out of Indian Territory in newspapers that were edited by native people. And so we thought, okay, we're the dog wagging the tail. What we need to do is to find the sources and then do the bibliography. So we started traveling around the country looking for repositories of newspapers. And what we found as we went around, places that should have huge collections. I'll give you an example. University of New Mexico Library. Walked in there and said, could we see your collection of native newspapers? And this one librarian looked at it and said, native newspapers, do we have any of those? And this woman said, well, I think there may be some in the ethnic studies vertical file. And so it didn't take us long to realize that nobody was keeping this. And of course, this was a 1983, 81, 82, 83 period. And at that point, there was a debate going in scholarly world about authority. Who has the authority to write about natives? Who has the authority to write about blacks? Who has the authority to write about Asian Americans, and so on. So we thought, okay, where is the native voice in all of this history? And there were some historical publications that wouldn't accept resources that were published in native newspapers at the time. And so we thought, okay, somewhere in the lava flats between Grants and Albuquerque, New Mexico, we decided we might as well be in hung for a sheep as a goat. And so we decided that we would start an archive. And what really cinched that for us was that I had been a visiting professor in history at the University of Arizona in 1982, and I had used the collection in the Arizona State Library, museum library on the campus there at Tucson. And they had a great collection of newspapers and periodicals published by tribes from the 1950s up to the 80s. And so we went out there to look at that collection, and we got there and it was gone. And I asked the librarian, whom I knew because I'd worked in that collection, over a year. I said, Mary, what happened to those newspapers? And she said, I weeded them. And I said, oh, no, what'd you do with them? She said, well, I was supposed to throw them away, but I put them in boxes and they're upstairs in storage. And I said, would you give them to me? And she said, well, how are you going to get them back to Arkansas? I said, I'm driving a pickup truck with a camper on the back. And so she said, come around the loading dock. They filled that camper. And that was the first seed collection. Well, later that summer, we were at UCLA at the Indian Studies Center Library. And V. Salabai, who was the librarian, she had been packaging the newspapers and periodicals in brown paper and tying them up in bundles, had them up on top of the stacks. And I said, V, I'm going to say something really stereotypical to you. I said, I know how you librarians think. I said, what are you going to do with these periodicals when you weed them? And she looked at me like, how did you know I was going to weed these? And I said, I'm married to a librarian. And so I said, if you weed them, when you weed them, would you give them to me? She said, yeah. So about a year and a half later, the phone rang one day, and she didn't say hello. She said, "Dan, this is V. Did you mean what you said?" I said, "Well, I usually mean what I say. What did I say?" She said, "You said you'd take these periodicals if I'd weed them." And she said, "Did you mean what you said?" And I said, "Yes, I meant what I said." She said, "Well, good, because I sent them out yesterday." She just wanted me to know they were on their way. So we put those two collections together, and that gave us, besides what we had already collected, that gave us a major jump on a collection. And at that time, the State Historical Society of Wisconsin had the largest archival collection, but they were beginning to microfilm theirs. And when they microfilmed, they sent us the originals. We keep the originals. Uh, so But now I'm glad we did, because now that you digitize everything, and even though we're digitizing, we're still keeping the originals, because we know that digital records start fading the minute they're made. And sooner or later, they're going to have to be redigitized. And so you can't redigitize them if you don't have original copies. So and we know that there will be a space problem sooner or later, but I know if you have enough space and you don't have anything to do in an archive, you're not doing your job. So,
Are any of these available online?
The Adam Matthew Company in London kept two digitizers busy here for several months, digitizing, I don't know how many 100,000 top issues they've digitized, but they only did about 5% of the collection. That is one of the best selling databases that they have in their catalog. And so a lot of that is available. Yeah. And then on microfilm, there was the old Clearwater collection that and a lot of the things that they photographed and microfilmed back in the 1970s no longer available. The people tossed the originals, and so that's the only way we have some of those. But we have microfilm here that I used in the 1960s, and it's still just as readable as it was then. And I mean, and we've got a machine that we can make digital copies off of. So however, whatever format it's in, we try to get images of as many of them, or the real copy of as many as we can. And every once in a while, we'll get a call from somebody that's been going through a closet and finding copies and saying, "Hey, you want these?" And we don't throw duplicates away because we find a lot of tribal libraries that get interested in publications, and we're able to supply. So I'm glad to do it.
Yeah. Such an amazing resource, and I'm so glad you could tell more people about it and what treasures you really do have. Is there anything else about the Sequoia National Research Center that you want to tell us about what it offers?
We have large manuscript collections from native writers, poets, novelists, historians, attorneys, librarians, whatever professional field they're in. We have a large number of collections from them. In the Choctaw area, and Francine can tell you what we've got in the Choctaw collection, but we do have a lot of material from the Locke family, so. And then, of course, we have a lot of microfilm material on the Choctaws, but we also have we worked with the U.S. Centennial Commission on World War I to identify the American Indians who served in World War I. And of the estimated 12,000, we have identified over 7,000 now. And that U.S. Commission, you can access our content through their website. So we're still doing research on that. That will never go away. Um, so uh, and we have a large library here, and uh, people that come in usually have enough here to keep them busy. Uh,
Yeah, kind of cool stuff. And someone was wondering, when you're collecting the newspapers, are you just concentrating on the 19th and 20th century, or do you have other focuses?
uh, we started out as uh, collecting contemporary because uh, we, the native voice was just not being heard, and we thought, who's going to write the history 50 years from now, 100 years from now? Is it going to be the same old thing again, where the conqueror, put that in quotation marks, allegedly writes the history? Um, but uh, it's you can't talk about the present without talking about the past. So we have bought a lot of microfilm images and digital images. Much of the Alaska Native material we have is on uh, 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 macro fish. Um, and we have, by the way, we have probably the largest collection of Alaska Native history and culture information in the lower 48, outside of maybe Washington State. We have a huge collection, uh, but that's a sidelight to what I was talking about. But we have newspapers from all periods now. For instance, we start with the Cherokee Phoenix, which was the first native newspaper. We have all of that on microfilm. That's the British Museum collection, which is the most complete collection. And then all through the 19th century, one time we wrote a grant to the Kerr Foundation and said we need to buy all of the microfilm that was published in the old Choctaw and Chickasaw nations that we can, and we did. so, so if you want to know, something that's going on in Caddo, well, we've got Caddo papers, and so
Oh wow, that is a lot. Because I know at OHS they have all that kind of stuff.
yeah,
You
and
know that
that's where
you all.
that's where we bought a lot of it. And I guess now they're digitizing everything, but and I mean that's the wave of the future. So, and then
Um,
we had an Osage patron who uh, bought all of the papers published in Osage County from, well, what the Osage Reservation and County, from the beginning until 1940. So we have all of Osage, newspapers. So,
that's nice of them.
yeah. But we had a patron who was willing to pay for it, and of course that adds to our collection, and so.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So you've clearly inspired some people because someone asked, "What's the physical location of your archive? Where can they visit you and see you?"
Um, physically or mentally or spiritually or physically, we are at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and we are in an abandoned shopping center at the corner of Asher and University Avenues. Um, and if you go on the web, we just Google Sequoia National Research Center, and you'll get our website. And on the website, we have a tribal writers library, digital library. We have a lot of resources there. You can look at our finding aids for our collections that we've processed, and the newspapers are in the catalog. Uh, and if you I'll tell you what, if you're interested in Choctaw removal, you need to look at this website that we launched October the 5th, and that is Journey of Survival, all one word, .org. Journeyofsurvival.org. And it's an eye opener. If you can get your machine to manipulate all the little tags and that sort of thing. I can't do it at home. I can do it on my machine here, but I can't do it at home.
Sounds like an amazing resources, and I hope everyone can check it out
Yeah,
and get
yeah.
it. And then, so now we have all the questions from everyone. So I'm gonna kind of go through the questions that people have been submitting throughout
Okay.
Conversation for the last 12 minutes that we have. Let's see. I remember Ryan had asked, what do you think needs to be done specifically about Choctaw removal? What kind of work should young scholars be looking at? Or
Well, once the people become acquainted with the whole process of Choctaw removal, and how we organized the website was that along certain routes there would be sites that were mentioned, that we found mention of in the records, whether that's Treasury Department records or whatever. We know that they were there on a particular day and they were transacting this kind of business there. But there are many places that are not marked. And, researchers need to start getting these site reports done. That's one thing that I think is really important. Take, for instance, like the crossing at Caddo Valley. I mean, this was a well-known place, and there were two ancient Caddoan mounds there, and the guy who lived there had a racetrack, and he used those mounds as his viewing stands around the racetrack, went around horse racing track. This in the 1830s during removal. Choctaws and Chickasaws both remarked about this guy. He supplied beef. He supplied corn, but there's not a marker there. I mean, and all across the state, it's like that for all these tribes. And there's a basic research there that needs, and just get communities involved. And I would think down, in those areas between Washington and Horatio, Arkansas, there are a number of sites along there that would be easy for Choctaws to access, would be easy for the Choctaw Nation to sponsor some kind of research program about those. And I think the communities would be happy to cooperate with the nation on that. We found everybody was really interested in the project we were doing, and what we're hoping, and this is the next step, get this into the curriculum of the public schools within the boundaries of the Choctaw Nation. When COVID-19 hit, we were working with a curriculum development group in the Northwest, about half of whom are American Indians, who developed curriculum according to the state standards through which the Lewis and Clark Trail went, to get Lewis and Clark Trail taught in the public schools. And that's been highly successful. They are wanting to do the same for Indian removal through Arkansas. And we're working with our State Department of Education to get that into teacher training, public schools, and get curriculum written when the COVID hit. And the State Department is still interested. They're still interested. We're still interested. And sooner or later it will happen. But that kind of activity could be done, from Choctaw Nation, where, you're developing curriculum about this event. Because it was a historical event and changed history of the Southwest for sure. So.
Cool. Thanks. That's a great kind of starting place for us is working historic preservation. So Terry Legan, I think that's your hopefully your last name. He says hi, and he wanted to know a little bit more about the history of enslaved people as they kind of went along in removal. Do you have any sources other than the Dawes records that might provide more insight about the individuals who came over on the Trail of Tears?
You know, all of the tribes except the Cherokees have, I would say, probably have all of their removal rosters exist. And those will, of course, you don't know the status of people because the people who wrote these lists had a category on the printed schedules for number of slaves, male and female, and so you don't know ages or anything like that. It's hard to get a statistical image of the people, but you do have information about numbers. You have in the Creek and Seminole removal rosters, you have free blacks. You have in the Seminole removal groups, you have even a lot of kinship, how people in the list are kin to each other on the list. So there is a good bit of, and then we know, for instance, a lot of the people, African descended people, were used as translators in removal. We know that some were used as wagoners, teamsters driving wagons, and we know that they were used in as hired out by slave owners to do certain tasks, and there are records that relate to that. So now it's not as complete as you might like to have, but at least you get a picture of overall picture of what's happening. Yeah.
Yeah. Angela also says a use for records for the Choctaw is the 1830 roll, but there's no online copies, unfortunately, for that.
Yeah. But those will sooner or later get online, and I think that would be a good research project for researchers to do, is to try to collect the removal rosters for the tribe and try to get those available. So
just like a never-ending list of things to do.
Oh yeah. That's the nature of research. It's never done, never finished.
So true. And then could you also describe the Freedmen resources at your Sequoia Center?
Okay. I have all of the research materials that I collected during that year I spent in the National Archives. Every time I went through a newspaper and found something about a freedman or about the freedmen of any of the tribes, I made an index card. I have all of that index card here that gives reference to newspapers articles. And since I published those books back in the 70s and 80s, I have tried to keep up with the subject as much as I could, even though I wasn't doing research. And so I have, all of the material I've put together since then. So it's a huge collection. It's a huge collection. So.
Yes. So it just seems like everyone's got to come visit you. So we're kind of out of time already, and so I just wanted so get to your questions. We'll try and hopefully we could have Dr. Littlefield back again one day soon, hopefully. maybe.
Well, one thing too, I have never attended a conference of any kind that I didn't have questions later that I wish I had asked. So, give my email address to any of your attendees who have questions, and I will be glad to answer those the best I can. So,
That sounds good. You could also just tell them yourselves because people will watch this video later on. So what is your email address?
okay, it is DF as in Daniel Franklin, DFLittlefiel. No D on the end. That's our way of keeping out trash mail. At ualr.edu. All small letters.
Perfect. That's great. So feel free to contact Dr. Littlefield about the Sequoia National Research Center. And I just want to say thank Yakoki, Dr. Littlefield, for all of your time today and sharing all of your knowledge. We clearly have so much work to be done in the future. So thanks everyone for tuning in for this episode of Chatta Tisholi. Our next one will be with Mike Fedoroff, who is a PhD student at the University of Alabama. We'll be discussing earth oven cooking and how he uses archaeology to learn more about the ways that our Choctaw ancestors cooked. Sure. And it'll be Wednesday, November 18th at 1 p.m. Peace and Lachiki, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for having me.